Hey friends, welcome back to another Seed Talk with Lisa and Layne. Hey Layne.
Hello, everybody.
So we are here to talk about a seasonal struggle, and Layne has a great show lined up for us. But before we jump into that, friends, if you're new here, welcome aboard. We appreciate it when you like and subscribe, but even more importantly, share our podcast with your friends. And so this podcast is brought to you by thegardenersworkshop.com, which is where is kind of our home base. It's where you'll find all of our resources, our online garden shop, our library stocked full of online courses. And that's where you'll find all the seeds that you hear mentioned on this show. Layne is the seed manager. So Layne, what are we talking about today?
So today we're going to be talking about the top 10 mistakes to avoid when you are direct seeding. So maybe you've already direct seeded some of your cool flowers and you're having a few issues. You're not seeing a lot of great germination, or maybe you're about to direct seed some beds, or maybe you're in the process of doing it right now. We just want to tell you some mistakes to avoid that we commonly see people making. So that way you can have nice thick stands of cool flowers coming up and they'll be beautiful for you the next spring.
Great.
And just keep in mind that we are specifically talking about direct seeding cool season hardy annuals in the fall, but a lot of the tips we'll be sharing should still be helpful to you, even if you're sowing at a different time of year.
Yep.
All right, let's get started. Okay, so our first mistake is going to be poor bed preparation. And this can be anything from just having a rock hard soil and you just throw some seeds out there, or maybe you have an area that has a bunch of leaves or wood chips mulched and you just throw some seeds out there and you're hoping it's going to work. What's the problem with that, Lisa?
So many problems. And I so understand why we think it should work, because I know that I actually practiced some of those steps. I specifically thinking about back when I used to use a lot of bark mulch in my garden.
Yes.
And I would not pull it back appropriately to actually expose fresh soil. So really what I have learned to be a key piece of our success is that the seed bed, the top of your bed where you're sowing seeds, should really be clear of debris and small pieces. I like to incorporate, some compost or leaf mold, like some type of finished organic matter. And I will tell you, if you're someone that struggles with soil that's got a lot of chunks and stuff in it, I have even topped off my bed with 2 to 3 inches of potting soil, not compost, not mulch, but literally potting soil, and made like a fine seed bed on the top. And that really works well and kind of gives you instant gratification.
Yeah, that's so true. And it's such a good tip to use potting soil or something if you need to, because it's so important for the seeds to have good seed to soil contact, or you're not going to have great germination. And even making sure the tops of the beds are smooth and level, that's another thing to be aware of.
Yeah, I am. I really like to make it flat and smooth because I actually plant in little troughs. And yeah, so that really helps.
And how do you plant in your troughs? Can you just describe that?
Sure, you can either use 2 fingers or a hoe. I tend to use my stand-up hoe to do this. And in a 30-inch wide bed, I typically put 3 rows of seeds. And I first make the center row trough. So that's kind of easy to figure out where that goes, right? Because you're going to pull it right down the center of the bed. And then I go back and space evenly across the bed the other 2, and it's about a 2 to 3 inch deep trough, and I plant my seeds in the bottom of that trough. And that allows 2 things. One, you have a visual, where did I plant those seeds? And the other is when you water, I only water in the trough. Why water the top of the bed to water the weed seeds that are sitting there waiting? So it helps with watering and also seeing where you actually planted the seeds.
Yes. And one other thing I wanted to mention, because in our garden here, we have so many leaves that fall that are just around. Try to pull those away from where you're going to be direct seeding, because it doesn't take much for wind to blow those onto your seeds. And maybe your seeds haven't even germinated yet, and they already get smothered out by these leaves blowing on top of them.
That's a really good one. One of the tips I give about leaf mulch is when I mulch the pathways in our garden around direct seeded beds, I typically don't do that till they're about 3 to 5 inches tall, just for that reason. The leaves
Exactly.
just work their way up into the bed and they will smother out either seeds or young little seedlings.
Yes, it's so true. Okay, our next mistake to avoid is sowing seeds outdoors that prefer to be transplanted. So I have some pictures of poppies up on the screen if you're watching over on YouTube, which we recommend sowing directly outdoors. But if you try to sow something like snapdragons outdoors, you might not have the success you're hoping for, right?
It's so true because, especially when I was speaking to large groups of people and traveling all over, after I would give a cool flower talk, someone would come up after and say, well, I've been direct sowing, let's just say snapdragons, outside in the garden for years and they do great. Well, the rule is that you're the exception instead of the majority rule. So it's not to say that it can't work, but for the easiest and most success, we go with the way that the seed prefers to be started. And yeah, trying to sow stuff outside in the garden that should be transplanted is just like you might as well just throw dollar bills out the window driving down the road. It's just not set, you're not set up for success.
Right. And some of the ones that we recommend sowing directly outdoors are Atriplex, Bachelor Buttons, Bells of Ireland, Bupleurum, Chinese forget-me-nots or Cinnaglossom, corn cockle or agrostemma, dill, larkspur, nigella or love and a mist, poppies, soapwort or saponaria, and orlea. Did I miss
Yes.
any there?
I know I was thinking, I kept listening for Nigella, but you got that one too. And
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, those just are really great, strong germinators when they're planted outdoors in the garden.
All right. So the third mistake to avoid is ignoring a seed's planting preferences when it comes to soil depth. So
Yeah.
covering a seed that doesn't want to be covered or not covering the seed that does want to be covered. And something that can be tricky about it, why you need to make sure to look it up for each seed, is you might think, oh, the tiny seeds are the ones, those are the only ones that need to be sown on the soil surface. But something like Bells of Ireland, that's a pretty chunky little seed there. And that actually also wants to be sown on the surface and not be covered.
That is so true, Layne. And I've often mentioned that when I'm direct sowing, because I tend to direct sow our entire cool flower garden at the same time, I go out and just do those beds. I literally take the cool flower book with me, as well as, of course, it says on our seed packets whether it
Right.
gets covered with soil or not. Because I don't try to even memorize that, because why memorize it when you can look it up, right? But yeah, some of the obvious ones, Bells of Ireland is a really great example that should not be covered, but yet you would think that it needs to be covered. And you can see that's what's pictured in this picture here is Bells of Ireland. And you can just see what great germination we get on that.
Yeah. So if you did sow a bed and you're not seeing a lot of germination, that's one thing to check is, did I accidentally
Yes.
cover that seed when it didn't want to be, or vice versa? So that's a mistake to avoid.
Yes.
Okay, the fourth mistake to avoid is sowing during undesirable weather conditions. And this can be anything from getting your timing wrong and you're sowing when it's way too hot outside, or trying to direct seed in January and it's way too cold outside. It could also be sowing when you know there's a big storm coming in and there's going to be high winds and really, really heavy downpours. So try not to sow during undesirable weather conditions and pay attention to your weather forecast.
Layne, I think this is perhaps, particularly for folks that are new to cool flower, the cool flower concept of fall planting, cool season hardy annuals, they're so excited and they get their seeds and then they'll think, oh, I'm going to get started early so I don't miss my time. And they sow the seeds way too early. And then they're so disappointed because the seeds will not germinate. Because it's just simply too hot outside. But you can count on the warm season weed seeds will germinate. And so the first maybe couple of weeks, you might be really good about keeping the little place that you planted weed free and tending to it. But after seeds not germinating, you just kind of forget about it. And so you chalk it up that there was something wrong with the seeds or, some other. And, but that is a really common problem that we face, or we hear from people. And the one thing that solves all the problems is to really think about, okay, this is a cool season seed. It needs to be sown when there's some cool conditions, like cool nights. And then the other part of it is for any seed to really germinate, they need some level of warmth. So sowing a seed in January in deep winter, it's just going to sit there dormant. But you again can count on that the cool season weed seeds will not lay dormant. They will quickly germinate and overtake your seed bed. And once again, you just don't understand why you didn't have success. So it's really about timing.
Yeah. And just remind everyone when they should be direct seeding their cool flowers in the fall.
Sure. So I plant seeds. My focus time is 6 to 8 weeks before my first historical expected fall frost. And I typically will also be planting my transplants. You can plant transplants today and plant seeds tomorrow, and that confuses people. But think about it this way, that 6 to 8 weeks until your first frost, which just means kind of winter is coming, and it's going to be cold outside, that 6 to 8 weeks, that seed is going to use to germinate into a little baby plant and then grow into about the size of a transplant before winter comes. That transplant is going to use that 6 to 8 week window to become established before winter comes. So really, transplants and seeds are planted on the same timetable.
Right. And we've mentioned before, there's a little bit less wiggle room when it comes to direct seeding. With your transplants, you can push that a little later if you need to, but because there needs to be some warmth in the soil, there's not as much wiggle room when it comes to direct seeding.
Exactly.
And one other thing I want to mention about weather is if you're expecting a nice, gentle rain in the next few days, that can be a really great time to direct seed some cool flowers, right?
I have been known to run out the evening in the evening with my seed packets in hand because I just saw that, a rain's coming, and there's just nothing like rain to water seeds and transplants in. So yeah, that's a great one too.
And I also just want to mention that if anyone is confused about which cool flowers they should be sowing in the fall or the timing, check out our episode number 49, which was our cool flowers fall planting checklist, and that can help answer some of those questions for you. Okay, our number 5 mistake to avoid is not leaving room between rows for your hoe. And this is a big one because weed pressure is one of the things that makes direct seeding so challenging, or it can if you don't set up
Yes.
your beds correctly. So go ahead, Lisa.
Yeah, so at the picture of me hoeing there is actually I'm hoeing some transplants, and I know that because there's 4 rows.
Right.
Typically, when I plant seeds, I plant only 3 rows in that same width bed that you're looking at, and that just allows more room to freely and quickly run the garden hoe, the stand-up garden hoe through the bed, that will disturb any developing weed seeds on the surface. This weed prevention step, you're just running the hoe through the top 1 inch of soil. You're not stopping and working in between each seedling. When you do it on a routine basis, you really eliminate and prevent about 95% of weed seeds from ever being born. And having room to do it without worrying about, oh, am I taking out little, developing little seedlings that are sprouting that you want to keep. Giving yourself extra space actually really creates a great way to do that.
Right. So how far in advance do you actually prepare your beds for direct seeding? And then when do you start this hoeing process?
So we typically try to sow our seeds, oftentimes the same day that we prepare the bed, but in the event that that doesn't happen, let's say we prepare today and then we don't sow the seeds for a week, which we really try to resist doing that, then you would need to disturb the top 1 to 2 inches of soil, whether you run a tiller through it or a garden rake, and that just eliminates any developing weed seed sprouting, which you typically cannot see, but they're there. And because if, let's just say you did that, you prepared today, didn't plant for a week, you plant your flower seeds, all the weed seeds in that bed have a 1 week jump on germinating and sprouting. And that is a really common problem.
Yeah. So how often do you make your hoeing passes?
Sure. So typically, the first time I hoe is about 10 to 14 days after sowing the seeds. And that's another reason I really love to use those troughs because I can just freely run my hoe. I just drop it in and run down I don't run, walk fast, pulling the blade in the space between those troughs, knowing that I'm not going to interfere with any. So I do that typically about 10 to 14 days from sowing, and then I do it about every 10 to 14 days.
Yeah. And that's another good reason to sow in the troughs, like you mentioned, so that it's very obvious this is where
Yep.
your intentionally planted seeds are, and then the rest are weeds. And what about for a home gardener, for example? Maybe they're not planning on sowing in rows. They're just going to scatter some out in a patch that they have. What's some advice for dealing with weeds in that type of space?
Sure. So the way that just kind of in a nutshell, the way that I would sow seeds in a landscape situation, meaning like maybe you want like a big old kidney bean shaped, plot in the middle of one of your flower beds, is you prepare the soil, get it as smooth, just like all the others. But then what I tend to do is to take my open hand and make deep hand imprints throughout the soil, and I space them about 5 or 6 inches apart. And then within that imprinted handprint is where I would sow multiple seeds throughout that. And that handprint is going to be like the trough. It's easy to identify. And then when you're hoeing, you can hoe everywhere but the imprint. And so that works really well. And if you have trouble, we also, I just was telling Layne, we've got a great image of a plastic fork is what we would often use to mark those handprints to like remind you where your handprints are.
So perhaps instead of leaving room between rows for your hoe, you could just leave enough space between those handprints.
Yes, very much so. It works really, really well.
Okay, mistake number 6 is going to be sowing too thinly. So we've talked a lot before about how you need to seed more thickly when you're direct seeding because you don't have control over the conditions. And there's so many things that can happen out there, like the seeds getting blown away or washed away or eaten by some creature. So it's really important to sow thickly and then just plan on coming back later on and thinning them out.
I mean, that is just one of the necessary steps. And I will say that I struggled for the first few years that I farmed. I could never get a nice stand of larkspur. Well, I was literally planting a seed every 6 inches, which is what the plants should be spaced in the row when it's all said and done. And I mean, stuff just happens. So, as a general rule, when I'm buying seed, I'll buy 5 to 6 times the amount that I think that I'm going to be sowing. Seed is the most inexpensive part of this whole process if you're flower farming. And if you're home gardening, you might not want to do it quite as thickly, but my goal is to put a seed about every inch or so. And then you're going to thin them to the required spacing that's recommended on your actual seed pack. And this is Bells of Ireland that you can see here. And this is a great example. This is before thinning, and probably 2/3 of the plants that you're looking at there will be pulled out, but the 1/3 that's left, I'll have a plant approximately every 6 inches for the entire bed, and there's 3 rows, and those plants are going to thrive and just perform beautifully. And also, just a little side note on the bottom right hand corner, that's a chickweed.
Oh,
Chickweed,
yes.
which many people are familiar with, is a cool season hardy annual. It thrives in the same conditions that many cool season hardy annuals do. And of course, because it is a native, it just germinates and goes, unlike many of the flower seeds that we're trying to nurture along. And so those will quickly be eliminated by the hoe when it runs through there the next time around. But
Right.
again, for a commercial farmer, having blank holes in your bed cost you a lot more than it does to oversow the seed if that's, what you really want.
True. Okay, mistake number 7 to avoid is not keeping beds moist during the germination process. It's so important that those seeds have enough moisture while they're trying to germinate, or you actually could just have a complete failure on your hands, right, Lisa?
Yeah, it's really true. And so this is where most of us fail, and I'm at the head of that, class. So that's why I'm always First off, we here in southeastern Virginia get more frequent rain in the fall, it seems like, and the soil stays moister longer, which is all the things that are stacking for you, planting at the proper time for these cool season annuals. However, you definitely got to water these. If you don't water, those seeds will just sit there being dormant. And as mentioned before, but you can count on the weed seeds are not going to lay dormant. They're going to take over. So, Dave Dowling really says that he recommends watering every day or every other day. And we literally do not use irrigation. We use a wand. That way you can just walk along and wet the bed. This is not a deep watering that you're trying to do. This is just moistening the seed. And this is bupleurum that we're looking at here in the image. And bupleurum is a slow germinator, slower than some, and they germinate in this skinny little foliage that's really easy to miss, especially because when they're just first coming up, they're a little maroonish kind of in color. They just fade right into the dirt. You don't even realize that they're there. And if you want to speed that process up to get them to this nice green, sprouting their first leaves, watering at least every other day. So, that's just a thought, but hand watering is definitely preferred.
Yeah. And I think it's really important, like you said, to think of yourself trying to keep this bed moist. You don't want to flood it with water, especially if you're dealing with really tiny seeds. You really could wash those seeds away or displace them. And then seeds that didn't want to be covered end up being covered. And then that's why your germination fails.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay. Mistake number 8 is walking on beds. And this is something that especially in a home garden, this can be difficult because I know a lot of people like myself, anytime I see an open little patch, I'm very tempted to just put stuff in there. But sometimes that's an area I know I'm going to need to be walking across to get to another space. But walking on beds is just not something you want to be doing when you're direct seeding or anytime, really.
Anytime. I'm trying to think, how am I going to say that? I will tell you that back when when we were in high production, when there were so many people helping us here on the farm, walking on beds was like literally the grounds for being terminated. I mean, it's like, it's that important. It's really easy to do that when you have 100-foot long beds. And if you don't have the leg length to step over the beds, the tempting is there. But all the work that we do in improving our gardens is diminished when you put weight and compress the soil. So there's never any time. And I just actually gave a talk just recently to a small group here in my neighborhood about, I never understood what stepping stones were intended for in gardens. I always thought they were just decorative pieces. They are actually there to direct your steps. So, that's where I'm going to step every single time. I'm not going to plant anything right in that spot, and it keeps you from stomping all over your garden. So in a home garden, stepping stones can really help to prevent unnecessary continuous stepping on beds in bad places.
Yeah. Or you'll just undo all the hard work we already talked about in mistake number 1, which is poor bed preparation. So
it's true. I mean, if you think about, we spend so much time fluffing the
right.
bed, so air and water will go through it, and then you put your big hoof on it, and that just squishes it all, right?
Right. Okay. Mistake number 9, and this is possibly not needed, but this is not using row cover for protection if you need it. So a very lightweight floating row cover, not only can it help retain moisture in your bed, but it also can protect from things like birds coming and pecking at your soil, or wind or rain blowing those seeds away. How do you recommend people implement lightweight floating row cover in their freshly seeded beds?
Sure. So this is yet another reason why you really should not plant your seeds early, because if you plant early and then cover them, which will intensify the heat, you're just really going to fail. So it's really great to wait to the proper time, water in the bed completely. And if you do have issues with any kind of varmints, rabbits just getting in there and rooting around, and squirrels just shoveling stuff every which way, and so row covers, we don't always do it. It really depends on the conditions outside and where I'm planting on my farm. Now we rarely use row cover But we'll use it in a nanosecond if I think, oh, this is an area where, it's close to the native border, which means we have heavy bird action over there. But it helps to retain moisture, but really protect the seeds from varmints carrying them off.
Yeah. And we're talking about Ag 19 is the weight of row cover you commonly use. And you actually don't even need to use hoops in this application if you're using it over a freshly seeded bed.
So true. So it's called literally the Ag 19's trade name is floating row cover. And that floating part is because, in fact, it can be used without support. But for long-term use, anything more than a couple of weeks, you want to support it. But yeah, we just use something heavy, whether it's weights or rocks, to hold it down, to keep the wind from blowing it off. And it does a great job.
What temperatures would you say it's way too hot to put this floating row cover down, even if you're having issues with animals getting at your seeds?
Yeah, I mean, anything, well, I mean, it's misleading because it says that it gives 4 degrees of protection. So that's in a cold situation, but in heat, if it's sunny outside, the heat that it will be intensified underneath that row cover is pretty intense. So I would say for cool season hardy annuals, if it's going above 75 degrees, I think I'd have to pull it back.
Yeah. And also, if you are using it in that floating application, like we mentioned, make sure you lift it before you water. Don't try to water your seeds through the row cover.
Yes.
Okay, and we're on to our last mistake, and this is specific to these cool season hardy annuals that you're direct seeding in the fall. And this mistake is thinning too early. It's very tempting once you start to see some action in there and you're hoeing and getting rid of those weed seeds. It's tempting right then and there to just say, well, I'm just going to thin it right now. Why is that not a good idea?
Because stuff happens over winter,
Right.
I mean, whether it's the weather or a vole that's the way I learned this lesson really, really intensely. So we used to lose a lot of larkspur to voles. And one year, I finally figured out I have to plant more seeds than plants I needed, right? So I finally got a great stand of plants. Well, then I was kind of so intense over wanting them to be spaced properly. I jumped in and thinned them in the winter, and early winter, right before Christmas time, thinned, and then we got a vole who really loves larkspur roots, and he just really made some holes in our bed. So my rule of thumb is that we start thinning direct sown cool season seedlings in what we call very early spring, like. For me, that's mid-February to mid-March. When we go out and you pull back a row cover, if they happen to be row covered, and you start to see there's a little bit of growth. You don't want a lot of growth to be happening because you want to get them thin before they do that. But it's early. It's a great time to work in the garden, on sunny afternoons when it's still kind of cold at night. It's really, really nice to go out, and that is the perfect time to thin seedlings.
And it's just kind of an insurance policy so that you know for sure these plants made it through winter before you take out the excess. So just wait to thin. And we actually have an entire episode about thinning your direct seeded beds in very early spring, and that's episode 27. So you can check that out too. And I just want to conclude by saying that just know the days that you're expecting these seeds to germinate in. And then if you really don't see anything, consider reseeding.
Yeah, because you can't wait much longer, and again, to plant on time, water them. That's a really important piece of the equation, right? And know what the seedling looks like so you know what you're looking for. For instance, how buplurum is really hard to see at first, and people don't think it's there. The giant poppy pod seedlings are the very same way. They're kind of dark when they first germinate, and you think they're not there. Well, they are there. So yeah, that is for sure.
All right. Well, that was it for this episode of Seed Talk. Hopefully you have avoided making any of these mistakes and you have nice, thick, direct seeded beds coming up. But if you're about to direct seed, just keep these things in mind as you're going about your business. Thank you so much for joining us as always. And we appreciate so much when you leave ratings or reviews in a podcast app or likes or comments over on YouTube. So thanks so much for watching or listening.
So thank you, Layne. So remember that we have a fully stocked online garden shop over at thegardenersworkshop.com where you'll find all those seeds that we just mentioned. Thank you guys for joining us, and thanks, Layne. Until we meet again, friends. Ciao.
Bye.